They called me Crazy Jax for burying food in the frozen dirt. But a 9-day blackout is hitting this town. Let's see who's crazy now.
Carl Mercer laughed so hard at the diner counter that hot coffee splashed across his knuckles. "Crazy Jax," he said. "Soldier boy out there digging holes like a dog, burying rocks, burying canned beans. Town's gone soft." Outside, the first heavy snow of November fell soft and slow across Silver Pass, Montana, and not one person in that diner knew the storm coming would kill the power for 9 days. Jax Harlan was a combat veteran with nothing left but a dog named Smoky and a promise he made to a dying man on a frozen mountain 10 years ago. They were about to find out what crazy looks like. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cold inside the cabin at 4 in the morning had its own particular weight, a dense and almost living pressure that settled along the floorboards and crept up the legs of the iron bed frame like slow water rising in a basement. Jax Harlan opened his eyes in the dark without moving. His body did this on its own now, this waking before sound, this checking of the room from beneath the surface of sleep. He did not stretch, he did not sigh, he listened. The propane heater in the corner clicked twice and held its low blue flame, no higher than a votive candle, set deliberately to the lowest setting that would keep the pipes from bursting and nothing more. Beyond the single window above the kitchen sink, the November dark was absolute, a black so complete that the snow falling outside could only be sensed by the soft and constant whisper of it against the glass. The wind had not yet started. The wind would come later. The wind always came later in Silver Pass. He swung his legs out from beneath the heavy wool blanket and let the soles of his bare feet meet the floor. The shock of the cold wood travelled up through his calves and into the small of his back, and he held it there for a long moment, the way a man holds the first sip of bitter coffee on his tongue, accepting it. The cold was honest. The cold did not lie to a man. At the foot of the bed, Smoky lifted her great head from her paws and watched him in the dark. Her amber eyes caught the blue flame of the heater and held it, 2 small pilot lights of their own, and her ears rotated forward in the silent and constant scan of a soldier still on duty. She did not whine. She did not rise. She simply made herself known to him with that one small motion of attention, the way she had been making herself known to him every morning for 9 years, in barracks and base hospitals and motel rooms, and now in this 2-room cabin at the dead end of a county road in a town that did not want him. "Morning, sister," Jax said, low and rough. The first words his throat had made in 15 hours. The dog's heavy tail thumped once against the rag rug. One thump, that was her language with him. One thump meant she had heard. 2 thumps meant something was wrong. He had not heard 2 thumps in a long time, and he was grateful for that. In the small private way a man is grateful for things he will never speak of out loud. He rose. He pulled on the worn, long underwear that hung from the bedpost, then the grey wool socks darned twice at the heel, then the canvas work pants stiff with old motor oil at the knees, then the flannel shirt, and over that the heavy military surplus jacket, whose cuffs had begun to fray into pale threads almost 2 winters ago. He had not bought a new jacket. He would not buy a new jacket. The jacket was older than Smoky, and had been with him longer than his marriage, and would, he suspected, outlast him as well. The cabin had 2 rooms, and that was a generous count. The front room held the kitchen counter with its single propane burner, the small wood stove he had not yet been able to afford to fix, the iron bed, a wooden chair he had built from a fallen aspen, a folding metal table, and the heater. The back room held a footlocker, a duffel bag, a workbench, and nothing else. There was no bathroom inside. The outhouse was 40 feet behind the cabin through the snow, and he had built it himself in September, and it was a good outhouse, plumb and tight against the wind. He took some pride in that. On the folding metal table sat the only thing in the cabin that could be called a decoration, a folded American flag in a triangular oak case. The glass smudged at one corner where his thumb returned to it, every morning without thought. He did not look at the names on the back of the case. He did not need to. The names were carved into him in places no one else would ever see. There was no photograph of his ex-wife in this cabin. There had been one, in his wallet for 7 years after the divorce. He had carried it because he could not stop carrying it, the way a man with a bad shoulder cannot stop carrying the ache. 2 summers ago, on a gas station bench outside Billings, he had taken it out and looked at it for a long time, and then he had set it on the bench beside him and walked away from it. He did not remember the walk back to his truck. He remembered Smoky pressing her body against his calf the entire drive that night, all the way through the dark, refusing to lie down on the passenger seat where she always lay. She had known. She always knew. The land had cost him $11,000. 6 acres at the dead end of Sawmill Road, sloping up toward the foothills of the Bitterroot, half of it useless rock, and the other half stubbled with second-growth pine and aspen. The cabin had come with it derelict, with one collapsed wall and a hole in the roof the size of a dinner plate. The realtor had laughed when she showed it to him. She had stopped laughing when she saw his face. He had paid in cash, a stack of 20s and 50s pulled from a coffee can, the slow accretion of 3 years of disability checks and seasonal work in 3 different states. The deed was the first thing he had owned outright since the divorce. The deed was, in some sense, the only thing he had ever owned outright in his life. The first thing he had done with the land, before he had patched the cabin roof, before he had built the outhouse, before he had cut a single cord of firewood, was dig. He had begun digging in the 2nd week of August, and he had not stopped digging until the first hard frost in late October had turned the soil to iron under his pickaxe. He had dug 11 holes across the 6 acres, each one chosen for drainage, for shelter from the wind, for proximity to a deciduous tree whose root system would not interfere with the cache. Some of the holes were 3 feet deep, some were 6. One, the deepest, the one nearest the cabin, was 8 feet down, lined with cedar planks and roofed with corrugated steel, and then covered over with 2.5 feet of packed earth and turf, so completely that a man could walk across it and never know what lay beneath. Into those holes he had placed things. Smooth river stones the size of cantaloupes sourced from the dry bed of Beaver Creek 2 miles west, gathered 1 10-gallon bucket at a time in the bed of his old Ford. The stones were thermal mass, they held heat. Buried in the earth below the frost line and stacked carefully against the cedar walls of the deepest cache, they would keep the small space inside 3 to 5 degrees warmer than the soil around it through the worst of any Montana winter, and they would do this without electricity, without propane, without any source of energy except the patient warmth of the earth itself. He had learned about thermal mass from a Vietnamese farmer outside Da Nang in his 2nd deployment, an old man who had shown him a root cellar dug in 1968 and never once flooded, never once frozen, never once failed in the half-century since. Jax had remembered. Jax remembered things. Cans of food rotated with the seasons, marked in his small, precise handwriting on lids he could read in the dark by touch. Beans, stewed tomatoes, tuna, spam, powdered milk in vacuum-sealed bags, rice in sealed 5-gallon buckets with bay leaves laid carefully across the top to keep weevils out. Hard candy for the children he did not know yet but suspected, in the back of his mind, he might one day need to feed. Water in 20-gallon polyethylene drums, treated with 2 drops of bleach per gallon, set on cedar pallets so they would not freeze through to the ground. A first aid kit in a steel ammunition can, sealed with rubber gaskets, containing things a normal civilian first aid kit did not contain. He did not advertise that, and in the deepest cache, the one nearest the cabin, behind the rows of food and the stacks of stones, he had set down 1 olive-drab military duffel bag, sealed in heavy plastic, that had nothing inside it that any other man would have recognized as supplies. That duffel was for him alone. That duffel was the reason for the rest. Smoky knew about the duffel. Smoky did not, and would not, ask. The neighbors had begun watching him in the 3rd week of August. He had felt them before he had seen them, that prickling along the back of the neck, which 13 years of combat deployments had hammered into him until it was as accurate as any radar. A car slowing on the road. A pickup pulled to the shoulder a 1/4 mile off. The silhouette of a man with binoculars. Children at the wire fence at the far edge of his property, not approaching, only pointing. The small shrill sounds of their voices carrying across the cold morning air. He had not waved. He had not chased them off. He had simply continued to dig, and Smoky had continued to lie at the rim of whatever hole he was working in, and the children had eventually grown bored and gone away. By the second week of September, the talk had reached him. It always reached him. Small towns were not designed to keep secrets, and a man digging large unexplained holes on 6 unimproved acres at the end of Sawmill Road was not a secret a town like Silver Pass could resist talking about. The waitress at the diner had stopped meeting his eye when she refilled his coffee. The clerk at Mercer's Hardware had begun watching his hands when he counted out cash for the next £50 bag of rice. A boy at the gas station had asked him in that flat too loud voice of a child repeating something he had heard at a kitchen table, whether it was true that he was burying his guns out there. Jax had paid for his gasoline and walked back to his truck without answering. Smoky had watched the boy from the passenger seat with her ears flat against her skull, and the boy had not asked again. Carl Mercer ran the hardware store. Carl Mercer ran, in a sense, the town. Carl was 61 years old, a man with a barrel chest and a grey moustache and small wet eyes that never quite seemed to focus on the person he was speaking to. He was the head of the volunteer fire department, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the head of 3 other things Jax had not bothered to learn the names of. Carl had decided, by the end of August, that Jax Harlan was the kind of trouble Silver Pass did not need. Carl had communicated this decision through a slow and steady erosion of small kindnesses. The kind of erosion only a man who has been excluded from many places in his life would have recognized as deliberate. The hardware store was suddenly out of £50 bags of rice. The locksmith was suddenly too busy to come out to the cabin. The propane delivery, when it finally arrived in mid-October, came at twice the going rate with a written note in Carl's blocky handwriting. "We are doing you a favour." Jax had paid the bill in cash. He had filed the note in the footlocker with the other documents of his life. He had said nothing. His pride was a thing he kept very close, the way a man keeps the photograph of a dead child close. He did not show it. He did not lean on it. He did not, under any conditions, allow it to be wounded by people who did not know what it had cost him to keep. He had stood in the corridors of the Veterans Administration Hospital outside Seattle for 11 months, learning what it meant to be a man without standing in his own country. And he had come out of those 11 months knowing that the only standing he was ever going to have again was the one he made for himself, in the small private acres of his own behaviour. Carl Mercer could think what Carl Mercer wanted to think. The hole behind the cabin was 8 feet deep, and the cedar planks were straight, and the river stones were stacked, and Smoky slept against his side every night, and that was enough. That had been enough for a long time. That had to be enough. The kettle was the first thing he had changed in the cabin. He did not own a kettle. He boiled water in an old saucepan with a long wooden handle, because the high sharp whistle of a kettle had taken him to a place, 2 years and 4 months ago, in the kitchen of a motel in Spokane, that he had only barely come back from. Smoky had pulled him back that morning by lying across his feet and refusing to let him stand up. He had thrown the kettle in a dumpster behind the motel that afternoon and bought the saucepan at a thrift store for $2.25. He did not own a ceiling fan either. He had removed the ceiling fan from the cabin in the first week of his ownership. The slow sweep of the blades, the small breeze on his face, had taken him at 3 o'clock in the morning to a rooftop in Kandahar, where he had lain on his belly for 9 hours waiting for a man who had never come. And he had woken in the middle of the cabin floor with no memory of how he had gotten out of bed, and Smoky had been pressed against his back with her body curved like a comma. He had unscrewed the fan that morning and put it in the back of the truck and donated it to the Goodwill in Hamilton on his next supply run. He managed his life this way, item by item, sound by sound, smell by smell. He did not call it managing. He did not call it anything. There were no words for it that he was willing to use about himself. There was only the steady, patient work of removing from his immediate environment the things that would betray him to himself. The wife had been named Carol. He did not say the name. He did not think the name. The name lived in him now the way a piece of shrapnel lives in the soft tissue of the back, surrounded by scar tissue, walled off, no longer dangerous to anything but the man carrying it. She had been beautiful once in the small, fierce way of certain women from certain Texas towns. She had laughed loudly. She had wanted things. He had given her, for 13 years, the things she had wanted. And then in the 14th year he had come home from Walter Reed with 2 surgeries on his right knee and a diagnosis stamped in red ink on a manila folder and a list of medications longer than her arm, and she had taken the house, and the savings, and the pickup truck that was not yet paid off, and she had taken them with the assistance of a lawyer named Brennan, and a judge named Pickett, and a system that did not know him and did not want to know him, and there had been nothing left to take. Smoky had been outside the courtroom on the day the papers were signed. The bailiff had told him no dogs in the building. He had argued he had not won. Smoky had waited for him in the cab of his truck in the parking lot, and when he had come back out into the white Texas sun, she had laid her great head against his sternum and held it there for a long time, and he had not cried, because he did not cry, but Smoky had pressed against him as if she were holding a wound closed with the weight of her body. Maybe she had been... He did not blame Carol. He had spent 2 years trying to blame Carol, and it had not done anything for him. And one morning in a motel in Cheyenne he had simply set the blame down on the nightstand, the way a man sets down a hammer he is no longer using. There were larger things to blame. There were systems, there were arrangements, there were the long invisible structures by which a country took its young men and used them up and gave them back to themselves with pieces missing and called it sufficient. He did not blame those structures either anymore. Blame was a luxury for men who still believed something could be done. He had stopped believing something could be done a long time ago. He had begun believing instead in the patient digging of holes and the placement of stones and the company of a dog and the keeping of a single promise made to a man whose face he still saw every night in the moments before sleep took him. The promise was the thing he did not speak of. Not to the VA counselor in Seattle. Not to the chaplain who had visited him in the ward. Not to anyone. The promise was the foundation under everything else. The promise was why he was here, in Silver Pass, and not anywhere else. He stepped into his boots and laced them. Smoky rose from the rag rug in one smooth, controlled motion. No wasted energy. The way a working dog rises when the day's work is about to begin. She stretched once, front paws out, hindquarters lifted, the long curve of her spine clean and deliberate. Then she stood beside him at the door and waited. Outside the snow was falling harder now. The wind had begun. Somewhere down on the county road, a single set of headlights crawled past, then faded into the dark. Jax Harlan stood in the doorway of his cabin with his dog at his hip and looked out across his 6 acres at the 11 small mounds of snow beneath which his 11 holes lay sealed and waiting. And he thought, as he thought every morning, about a man named Thomas Voss and the cold and the supply lines and the promise. He thought, this is enough. This is enough for one more day. The wind picked up. It came down off the Bitterroot in a long, low, moaning rush. And somewhere in the dark above the cabin, a tree branch snapped and fell. Smoky's ears swiveled toward the sound and held. Then she pressed, very gently, against the side of his knee. Once, he understood her. She was telling him the storm was bigger than the forecast. I know. Sister, he said. I know. He stepped out into the snow. The storm was bigger than the forecast. By noon, the snow was coming down at the rate of 2 inches an hour, a wet, heavy snow with a high water content that caked along power lines and tree limbs and the steel rails of the grain elevator on the far edge of town. And by 3 in the afternoon, the first of the lines had come down out near Highway 93. By 5 o'clock, the National Weather Service had issued a blizzard warning that supplanted the earlier winter storm advisory. And by 6 o'clock, the Ravalli County Sheriff's Department had closed 7 of the 9 secondary roads leading out of Silver Pass. And by 7 o'clock, the lights in Mercer's Hardware on Main Street had flickered twice and then gone out, and the lights in the county courthouse 1 block over had flickered twice and then gone out, and the lights along the river road had flickered twice and then gone out, and across the entire valley, in a slow rolling cascade that took less than 90 seconds, the grid had failed. Inside Jax Harlan's cabin, the failure registered as a small click from the propane heater as it cycled, a small dimming of the kerosene lantern on the kitchen table that was only the slight draft from the front door pulling at the wick, and nothing else. He did not have grid power in the cabin. He had not bothered to wire it. He had run the place on the heater and the lantern, and a single 12-volt battery hooked to a small solar panel on the south wall, and the battery ran a single LED bulb above the workbench in the back room, and that was all he needed. The sudden darkness across Silver Pass did not change his cabin, it only changed the world. He knew the moment it happened. He felt it through his boots, the way a man on a ship feels the engines cut out below the deck. The town went silent. There had always been, beneath the wind and the snow, a low hum of the world, the distant sound of refrigeration units and street lights and the heater fan in the gas station 2 miles down the road. That hum was gone now. There was only wind, there was only snow against glass. Smoky raised her head from the rag rug. Her ears rotated forward, then flattened, then rotated forward again. She rose. She walked to the front door and stood there, looking up at the latch. "Yeah," Jax said. "Yeah, I felt it too." He pulled his jacket off the peg by the door. He pulled his wool watch cap down over his ears. He took the heavy, long-handled flashlight off the workbench and tested it. The beam was strong. He tucked a second, smaller flashlight into his jacket pocket, along with 2 spare battery packs. He clipped the leash to Smoky's harness, although he did not need to. The leash was for other people in case other people came. Smoky did not need to be led. He stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him broadside coming around the corner of the cabin, and the snow drove into his beard and his eyes and the small exposed strip of skin between the cuff of his glove and the cuff of his jacket, and he turned his face into it the way a man turns into a cold shower he has chosen. The visibility was less than 30 feet. The temperature, by his estimation, had dropped to somewhere between -4 and -8, and the wind chill was carrying it down toward -20. Smoky walked at his left hip, a quarter step behind, exactly where she had walked for 9 years, and the snow caked along her muzzle and her shoulders within seconds, and she did not slow down for it. He walked the line of his property first. This was discipline. This was what a man did before he did anything else. When the circumstances changed, he checked the perimeter. He confirmed the security of his caches. The 11 mounds were intact, snow-covered, undisturbed. The cabin behind him glowed faintly through its window with the warm orange light of the kerosene lantern. The outhouse was solid. The truck was where he had parked it, banked already with 8 inches of fresh snow, and he started it and let it run for 10 minutes to keep the engine block from freezing, and then he killed it and went back inside. He sat at the folding metal table with Smoky at his feet. He listened to the wind. He waited. He did not know yet what he was waiting for. He only knew, with a certainty that lived below the level of thought, that something was coming. It came at 9:47 that night. The knock on the door was not loud. It was 3 small careful taps, the kind of knock made by a person who has used the last of their courage to lift their hand. Smoky was on her feet before the second tap. She crossed the room and stood at the door with her ears forward and her tail still, and she did not bark. She looked back at him once, one thump of the tail against the floor. He opened the door. The woman on his porch was small and snow-covered, and holding a sleeping child in her arms. The child was wrapped in a quilt, only his face visible, and his cheeks were red from the cold, but his breathing was steady. The woman herself was perhaps 32 years old, with a dark braid coming undone beneath the hood of a thrift store parka 2 sizes too large for her, and her boots were soaked through to the laces, and there was a thin crust of ice along her upper lip where her breath had frozen on the way to his house. She did not introduce herself. She did not say good evening. She said, in a voice scraped down to its absolute necessities, 3 words, "Mrs. Bennett's insulin." He stepped back from the door. He held it open. He said, "Come in." She came in. She brought with her a small column of cold air and a flurry of snow that vanished within seconds against the warmth of the cabin floor, and Smoky stepped aside without being asked, and the woman stood just inside the door with her son in her arms and her breath coming in short ragged pulls and her eyes too bright in the lantern light. "Sit down," Jax said. She sat. She sat on the wooden chair he had built, and she shifted the boy in her arms so that his weight was supported against her chest. And she looked at the iron bed and the folded flag and the saucepan on the burner and the lantern and the dog who was now standing 4 feet away from her with her tail at half-mast, and she began, very quietly, to cry. She did not make any sound. The tears simply ran down her cheeks in 2 thin parallel lines, and she did not wipe them away, because to wipe them away she would have had to shift her son, and she would not shift her son. He went to the burner, he lit it, he set the saucepan on it with water, he took a tin of instant coffee down from the shelf and put a heaping spoon into a tin mug and another into a second tin mug. And he did all of this without looking at her, because he understood, in the small private way he understood many things he did not say, that a woman crying like that did not want to be looked at. She wanted only to be allowed. When he set the mug down on the table beside her, she said, without looking up, "I'm Hadley Voss." "Jax Harlan." "I know." Her voice cracked on the second syllable and she swallowed and tried again. "I know who you are. I tried to bring you a casserole in September. I remember the car. Carl Mercer told me not to. I figured. He said you were dangerous. I'm not. I know." She looked up at him then finally, and her eyes were a clear grey, and the tears had stopped, and there was something in her face that was not quite asking for help, because she was not the kind of woman who asked for help. It was something else. It was the look of a person who has run out of options and is bringing the last option to a door they had been told not to knock on. "Mrs. Bennet is out of insulin," she said. "She's 81. She's a type 1. She has been for 63 years. The pharmacy is dark. The county roads are closed both ways. Highway 93 is closed." I called. "There is no medical transport coming until at least Tuesday. And she has, I think, maybe 16 hours, he said. "What kind of insulin?" "Novolog, the fast-acting. And Atlantis for the long." "She takes both." "How much does she have left?" "1 vial of Novolog, about 40 units. She uses 30 a day." "Does she have backup?" "She had backup. Her grandson was supposed to drive over from Missoula on Tuesday with the next month's supply. Then the storm." Hadley shifted her son in her arms. "There's a pharmacist in Hamilton who would open up if anyone could get there, but no one can get there. I tried to call the sheriff and they told me they have 92 priority calls already and a single deputy on the road, and that medical emergencies are not currently being prioritized over wellness checks, because they have 8 people trapped in cars on Skolkoho Pass right now. I'm not trying to make her sound important. I'm only telling you the situation. She is a friend of mine. She watched my son when his father left. She is currently the closest thing I have to family in this town." He said, "Where is your father?" The question came out of him before he had the chance to stop it. He did not, as a rule, ask questions of strangers. He had asked it because something in her face had pulled it out of him, and he saw, the moment the question left his mouth, that he had reached into a place in her where there was old pain. "He's gone," she said. "He's been gone a long time." She did not elaborate. He did not press. He stood. He took down his jacket again. He buttoned it. He pulled on his gloves. He went to the back room, opened the footlocker, removed a small black insulated medical pouch, and brought it out to the table. He set it down in front of her. He unzipped it. Inside the pouch were 4 glass vials. The labels were in his small, precise handwriting. Novolog, Lantus. Novolog, Lantus. The expiration dates were 6 months out. There were 2 unopened insulin pen sets beside the vials and a strip of glucose tabs, and 2 unopened sets of syringes in their sterile wrappers, and a small laminated card with dosing instructions that he had photocopied from a VA pamphlet 18 months ago. Hadley stared at the pouch. She did not move. Her son shifted in her arms and made a small sound against her shoulder and went back to sleep. After a long moment she said,
"Why?"
"Why what? Why do you have this?" he said. "I keep some." "You keep insulin." "I keep some." "For who?" He looked at her for a long moment. Smoky had come to stand beside the table. Her amber eyes moved from Hadley's face to Jax's face to the pouch on the table and back to Hadley's face. The wind outside the cabin pushed against the glass of the kitchen window with a long, slow groan. "For whoever needs it," Jax said. She began to cry again. She did not make any sound. Smoky stepped forward and laid her great muzzle, very gently, against Hadley's knee. Hadley reached down with one hand without looking and put her palm on the dog's broad skull, and the dog stood there, perfectly still, holding the woman up with the simple weight of her own attention. Her tail thumped softly, exactly once, against the leg of the table. Jax zipped the pouch closed. He picked it up. He said, "Where is she?" "2 doors down, the white house with the green shutters. She's alone." "All right. I have to bring my son. I cannot leave him at home. I have no one." "Bring him. We will go in my truck. The county roads are closed, but the connector to Bennett's house is on this side of the closure." "Smoky comes." Hadley nodded. She rose, slowly, with the boy in her arms. She looked at Jax across the small table in the lantern light, and she said, in a voice that was neither grateful nor apologetic, but something else, something simpler and older, "Thank you for opening the door." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We have not done anything yet." "You opened the door." He did not answer. He did not know how. He went out to start the truck. The wind was harder now. The snow was sideways. Smoky walked at his hip through the dark, and behind him in the cabin he could hear Hadley speaking, low and tender, to her sleeping son. He drove with the lights on low beam and the wipers on high, and the heater set to a temperature that would keep the windshield from fogging without overheating the cab, because Hadley's son was now awake, and he was 4 years old, and he was watching Smoky from the bench seat, with the wide, solemn eyes of a small child meeting a very large dog for the first time. Smoky was riding between them, her body angled so that her flank was pressed against the boy's small shoulder, her great head turned toward the windshield, and the boy had one mittened hand on the dog's foreleg and was not letting go. "His name is Cole," Hadley said. "Cole," Jax said. He did not turn his head. He was driving. "You can pet her. Cole. She likes that." The boy looked up at his mother. Hadley nodded. Once, Cole pressed his small face into the thick double coat of Smoky's shoulder, and Smoky did not move. She did not even adjust her ears. Her tail thumped, very softly, against the vinyl seat. One thump. The drive to the Bennett house took 11 minutes. It should have taken 3. The truck broke through drifts that were already 3 feet deep across the road in places, and twice Jax had to back up and ram a drift twice before the heavy Ford would push through, and twice Cole let out a small frightened sound, and twice Smoky pressed her body more firmly into the boy's side, and they got there. Mrs. Bennett was sitting at her kitchen table with a kerosene lamp turned down to its lowest wick and a small camping stove on the counter beside her brewing a pot of tea. She was wrapped in 3 sweaters and a wool blanket. Her hair was the colour of clean wood ash and was pinned up with a single tortoiseshell comb. Her hands trembled slightly on the table when they came in, and that was the only thing in her bearing that suggested she was 81 years old and 17 units short of her evening dose. She looked up as Hadley came through the door with Cole and Jax and Smoky behind her, and she said in a voice that was thin but completely steady, "Well, you found someone." "This is Jax Harlan," Hadley said. "I know who he is. I have lived 2 doors down from him for 14 weeks. Mrs. Bennett's pale eyes went to Jax's face and stayed there. "Mr. Harlan." "Ma'am, Hadley says you have insulin." "Yes, ma'am." "Where did you get insulin?" "The Veterans Administration provides it. I requested a backup supply. They provided it. I rotated a portion of my own and kept it as a reserve." "For whom?" "For whoever might need it." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Smoky. She said, "Sit down." "Mr. Harlan." "Sit down." "Hadley, have a cup of tea while I shoot myself up." He sat. Hadley sat. Smoky lay down at Cole's feet. And Cole, who had not let go of his mother's hand since they entered the house, slowly released her hand and sat down on the floor beside the dog, with the deliberate care of a child being trusted with something precious. Mrs. Bennet took the vial of Novolog. She drew the syringe with the steady hands of a woman who had drawn syringes before breakfast 4 times a day since the year 1962. She injected herself in the soft tissue of her left thigh through the layers of her pajama pants, capped the syringe, and dropped it into the empty coffee can she kept on the counter for that purpose. She poured tea for the 3 of them. She did not pour any for herself. She sat down again. "How long?" she said. "Has this town been mocking you? Mr. Harlan." "Since August." "How long have they been calling you crazy?" "Since August." "And you brought me insulin in a blizzard." "Yes, ma'am." She closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. "Do you have any other supplies in those holes of yours?" "Mr. Harlan." "Yes, ma'am." "What do you have?" "Food." "Water?" "Medical?" "Wood." "Kerosene." "Battery banks." "Heat sinks." "Heat sinks." "River stones." They hold thermal mass. Below the frost line they create a small pocket of warmth that can be transferred to a sealed shelter. "How much food?" "Enough for 40 people for 30 days. Or 80 people for 15. The kitchen went very quiet. Hadley set down her tea. "40 people for 30 days, Mrs. Bennet said. "Yes, ma'am, and no one in this town knows. No one in this town has asked, ma'am." She closed her eyes again. When she opened them this time, there was something in them that had not been there before. It was not quite anger. It was something colder and older than anger. The long, sad knowledge of a woman who had lived in Silver Pass for 61 years, and who had in those 61 years watched her town do this kind of thing to other men. "The school is sheltering people," she said. "Carl Mercer has it set up as the warming centre. They have a generator. The generator will not run all night because the propane tank is the wrong size. There are 42 people at the school as of 2 hours ago. 14 of them are children. 3 are infants. They have 1 case of bottled water and the cafeteria's emergency dry goods. That is all." Jax said nothing. "Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Bennet said. "I'm asking you. Will you come with me to the school?" "Ma'am." "Will you bring what you have?" He did not answer right away. He looked at Smoky. Smoky was already looking at him. Her amber eyes were perfectly steady. Her tail thumped, exactly once, against the kitchen tile. "Yes," he said. "Then we go now." It took them an hour to load the truck. Jax drove back to the cabin with Hadley, while Mrs. Bennet dressed for the cold and packed her own go-bag. He pulled the corrugated steel cover off the smaller cache nearest the road. He brought up 6 plastic bins of food, 2 cases of bottled water, a propane camp heater, 2 cans of kerosene, 4 wool blankets still in their original surplus packaging, a coil of paracord, a box of waterproof matches, 2 LED lanterns, a small first aid kit, and 3 sealed bags of hand warmers. He worked fast. He worked in the small, precise patterns of a man who had loaded supply pallets in the back of a Humvee under conditions that were not unlike these conditions, only hotter and louder. Hadley helped. She did not ask what each thing was. She did not ask why he had it. She simply moved when he told her where to move, and she lifted what she could lift. And Cole sat in the cab of the truck with the door open and the heater running. And Smoky stood in the snow at the edge of the cache hole with her ears forward, and she watched. "You've done this before," Hadley said. At the 18-minute mark, when Jax had loaded the last of the bottled water into the bed. "Yes." "Where?" "Other places. Other holes." "Yes." She did not ask him anything more. He did not offer anything more. They drove to the school. The Silver Pass Elementary and Middle School was a single low brick building set back from Main Street behind a stand of pines, and the gymnasium attached to it was the largest indoor space in the town, not currently dark, because the school district had a mid-sized backup generator that was, indeed, the wrong size for its propane tank. The parking lot was full. The portable signs at the entrance had been overturned by the wind. The front double doors had been propped open by someone and a sheet of plastic taped over the gap to slow the wind, and people were moving through that gap in coats and quilts and parkas with armloads of small belongings, and there were children crying somewhere inside. Carl Mercer was standing inside the front doors with a clipboard. He looked up when Jax came through the plastic with Smoky at his hip, and Hadley behind him with Cole on her hip, and Mrs. Bennet behind her with a wool blanket around her shoulders, and his face went through 3 expressions in the space of about a second. The first expression was confusion, the second expression was recognition, the third expression was something tighter and meaner than either of those, and it settled in along the muscles around his jaw, and he straightened up to his full 6 feet 2 inches, and he stepped into the middle of the doorway, and he said, "Hold up." Jax stopped. "What are you doing here?" Harlan. "Bringing supplies." "Whose supplies?" "Mine." "From where?" "The cabin." "From those holes?" "Yes." Carl looked past him at the truck idling outside, at the bins stacked in the bed, at Hadley standing in the cold with her son. His eyes came back to Jax's face. "I don't think we need anything you've got." "Harlan. There are 42 people in this building, and we are taking care of them. You have 1 case of bottled water. We are taking care of them." "Carl." Mrs. Bennet's voice came up from behind, thin and steady. "Carl. Get out of the man's way. This is a managed shelter." "Cleo. This is not a free-for-all." "Carl. You are out of your depth, and you have been out of your depth since 7 this evening. And the man behind me has, in the back of his truck, more emergency supplies than this entire county has stockpiled, and you're going to step aside and let him bring them in." "Cleo. With all due respect." "With all due respect, Carl, I have 140 units of insulin in my body right now that I would not have without him, and you can either step aside or you can find out what it looks like when an old woman in 3 sweaters slaps the foreman of the volunteer fire department in front of 42 of his neighbors." Hadley made a sound that was almost a laugh. Cole turned his face into her shoulder. Carl Mercer looked at Mrs. Bennet. He looked at Hadley. He looked at Smoky. And Smoky did not look away. Her tail was perfectly still. Her ears were forward. He stepped aside. Jax went through. The gymnasium smelled of wet wool and diesel and the faint sour edge of fear. The fluorescent lights were off. Someone had set up 4 LED work lamps in the corners on tripods, and they cast long stretched shadows across the wooden floor, and the bleachers had been pulled out only halfway because there had not been time to do more, and people were sitting on every available surface with their belongings around them, and the children were huddled against the adults, and the air was perhaps 52 degrees, and the generator outside the back door was loud enough that every human voice in the room had to be raised to be heard above it, and the diesel exhaust was leaking in at the gap of the back door, and Jax registered all of these things in the first 2 seconds of crossing the threshold, and he knew, with the cold professional knowledge of a man who had organized field shelters in 3 different countries, that this room was 40 minutes from a crisis even without the storm. He set down the first bin of supplies inside the door. He did not announce himself. He did not call out to the room. He simply began to work. He moved the propane camp heater into the center of the room and lit it at half setting to take the immediate edge off the cold without overloading the air. He distributed the wool blankets to the families with infants first. He set up the LED lanterns at intervals along the bleachers so that there were no longer any pools of pure dark in the gymnasium. He wedged a folded blanket against the gap at the back door where the diesel was leaking in, and the air in the gym began, within minutes, to clear. He passed bottled water to the people who looked dehydrated first. He set a pot of water on the camp stove and began making instant coffee, because instant coffee was a small thing that signaled to a panicked room that someone was in charge. He did all of this in 28 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not in fact speak more than 7 sentences in those 28 minutes, all of them short. Hadley moved with him, and Mrs. Bennet moved with him, and a man named Ed Boucher, who had been a fireman in the 70s, began moving with him without being asked. and a woman named Linda from the Methodist Church began moving with him without being asked. And within an hour, the gymnasium had become, without anyone declaring it, his. Carl Mercer watched from the doorway. His clipboard hung at his side. He did not say anything. He did not approach. His face had gone through several more expressions in that hour, and the last of them, the one he settled into and held, was a kind of small private bewilderment, the expression of a man who had been certain about something for a very long time, and was now, very slowly, beginning to wonder. Smoky moved through the room behind Jax. She did not interfere. She did not greet. She walked at a slow, steady pace along the outer perimeter, her ears swiveling, her amber eyes taking in every face, and she paused, twice, beside two different children who were crying, and she lay down beside each of them for a long, careful minute, and the children stopped crying, and then she rose and continued her circuit. She was working. She had been working for 9 years. She did not need instructions. By midnight, the gymnasium was warm. By 1 in the morning, every adult in the room had a tin cup of coffee or instant cocoa in their hands. By 2, the children were asleep. Jax sat on the bottom bleacher with his back against the second tier and his hands loose on his knees, and Smoky curled at his feet with her head on his boot. And he watched the door, and he did not sleep. In the parking lot, the wind howled. The storm was not done. It was not even, he thought, half done. He was right. The second day of the storm did not begin so much as it slowly revealed itself. The sky outside the gymnasium windows did not lighten. The wind did not slacken. The snow did not stop. There was only, sometime around 6 in the morning, a small change in the quality of the dark beyond the glass, a blue-greyness where there had been pure black, and the children in the gymnasium began, in scattered places, to stir. Jax had not slept. He had moved twice in 7 hours, each time to refuel the camp stove, and each time Smoky had risen with him and walked at his hip and lain back down again where he stopped. The propane heater was running at half. The room was holding at 58 degrees. The air was breathable. The diesel from the generator outside had stopped leaking in once he had wedged the back door, and at 4 in the morning Ed Boucher had reported to him quietly that the generator was running rough, that it was probably going to fail before noon, and Jax had nodded and said only, "Then we will need the second propane heater from my truck." He felt the trigger before he understood what it was. It happened at hour 18 of the storm, a little after 7 in the morning, in the small, loud, private space behind his sternum, where his body had been keeping time independently of his mind for 9 years. The generator outside the back door had been running rough since 4. Ed Boucher had gone out at 6:30 to top off the propane, and had come back smelling of diesel exhaust and cold, and that smell had lifted off the wool of his jacket and crossed the gymnasium and reached Jax where he sat on the bleacher, and his hands, which had been resting loose on his knees, closed into fists without his permission. He felt his pulse change. He felt the small fine tremor begin in the muscle of his right thigh just above the knee. He felt his hearing sharpen, the way a dog's hearing sharpens at the edge of a tree line, and he heard, suddenly and with terrible clarity, every sound in the gymnasium at once. A child coughing in the far corner, a grandmother's hoarse breathing on the bleacher behind him, the hiss of the propane heater, the scrape of a folding chair, the distant laboured growl of the generator, a boot heel on hardwood, a zipper, a small high voice that had begun, in some other part of the building, to cry. Smoky lifted her head from his boot. He stood up. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he had to be outside this room, and he had to be outside it now, and he had to be outside it before the thing inside his chest finished its slow, cold movement up into his throat. He walked to the side door. He pushed through it. He stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him broadside, and he turned into it, and he kept walking. The snow in the parking lot was knee-deep and unbroken. He did not lift his feet to clear it. He pushed through it the way a man pushes through cold seawater toward the line of breakers offshore. The wind was hard. The visibility was nothing. He went forward until he could no longer see the gymnasium behind him. And then he went forward another 20 steps, and then he stopped. He bent at the waist. He put his gloved hands on his knees. He breathed. The breathing did not work. The breath went in and the breath came out, and the breath did not reach the part of him it needed to reach. The thing in his chest had moved up into his throat now, and it had teeth, and it was not interested in being breathed away. He saw, with the cold clarity of a man watching a film, the inside of a Humvee on a road outside Mosul, and he saw the face of a corporal named Jensen who had been 23 years old and from Pittsburgh, and he saw the small, precise pink hole that had appeared in the side of Jensen's neck while Jensen was telling a joke about a girl from his high school, and he saw his own gloved hands trying to keep the blood inside Jensen's neck while the medic worked, and he saw the snow. The snow was new. The snow did not belong in the Humvee on the road outside Mosul. The snow was here. The snow was on his shoulders and in his beard and on the back of his gloves, and the cold of the snow was the cold of Silver Pass, and the cold of Silver Pass was not the dust of the road outside Mosul, and he held to that, the way a drowning man holds to a piece of broken hull, and he tried to come back. He could not come back. The next thing his mind reached for was not Mosul. It was older. It was farther up the chain. It was a mountain pass at 12,000 feet, and the temperature was -26, and the convoy that was supposed to bring fuel and food and ammunition had not come, and Thomas Voss was in the snow, and Thomas Voss was speaking to him through a face that was already going grey at the edges, and Thomas Voss was saying, slowly and with great difficulty, the words that had been the foundation of Jax Harlan's life ever since. Don't let it happen. Promise me. Don't let it happen again. He went down on one knee in the snow. He did not feel the cold. He did not feel his body. He felt only the soft, heavy weight pressing into his thigh, and the slow, steady warmth of a working dog's chest against his hip, and he understood after a moment that Smoky had come out of the gymnasium behind him and had found him in the dark and was now leaning her full body weight against his leg and was refusing, with the absolute professional refusal of a soldier on duty, to move. He put his gloved hand on her head. She did not move. He put both gloved hands on her head, and he put his forehead against the top of her skull, and he breathed in the smell of her wet fur, and the smell of cold snow, and the smell of his own jacket, and he said, very low, because there was no one in the world to hear him except her, I am here. One thump. He did not know how long he stayed there, kneeling in the snow with Smoky pressed into his thigh and his forehead against her skull. It might have been 3 minutes. It might have been 10. The wind howled across the parking lot above them, and the storm did its work, and somewhere in the gymnasium behind them 42 people were waiting for him to come back inside, and he did not come back inside, not yet, not until the thing in his chest had moved back down out of his throat, and resumed its place behind his sternum where it lived all the time, and his breathing had come back, and the part of his mind that recognized the snow as Silver Pass had reasserted itself over the part of his mind that recognized the snow as the mountain pass, and his hands had stopped shaking inside his gloves. When he finally rose, slowly, with one hand on Smoky's shoulder for balance, he saw that he had a choice. The truck was parked at the edge of the lot. The keys were in his pocket. He could walk to the truck, he could start it, he could let it warm, he could put Smoky in the cab beside him. He could back out of the lot and turn onto Sawmill Road and drive the 11 miles back to the cabin, and he could pack the cabin into the truck bed in 2 hours, and he could drive south on the smaller roads, and he could be out of the state by Tuesday, and he could find another small town with cheap land, and he could begin again, and no one in Silver Pass would ever see him again, and the gymnasium behind him would manage with what he had already brought, and Carl Mercer would tell the story, in years to come, of the crazy soldier who had vanished in the middle of the storm, and that story would harden into a kind of legend, and the legend would not be true, but it would not need to be true, because there would be no one to correct it. He thought about the truck. He thought about it for a long time. Smoky leaned harder against his thigh. Not enough to move him. Just enough to be felt. He thought about the duffel bag in the deepest cache. He thought about the names. He thought about Thomas Voss. He thought about a small carved wooden bird on the shelf in the back room of the cabin. He thought about Hadley's face in the lantern light. He thought about Cole asleep against his mother's shoulder. He thought about the boy's small mittened hand on Smoky's foreleg in the cab of the truck and the way Smoky had not moved. He turned around. He walked back to the gymnasium. Smoky walked at his hip. The side door was unlocked the way he had left it. He pushed it open and stepped inside, and the warmth of the room hit him at a level he had not been ready for. And for a moment his vision went grey at the edges, and he stood in the doorway with one hand on the jamb and let it pass. When his vision came back, he saw Hadley. She was standing about 10 feet away from the door with 2 tin mugs in her hands. The steam was rising off them. She had been waiting. She had not, he realized, been waiting for very long because she was not wearing her parka and her cheeks were not flushed with the cold, and she had only stepped over from the camp stove when she had seen him come back through the door. She did not say anything. She held out one of the mugs. He took it. "You came back," she said. "Yes, Mrs. Bennet said you might not. Mrs. Bennet knows things." "Yes." Hadley looked at Smoky. She looked at the snow on Smoky's shoulders, melting now in the warmth. "She does." He drank the coffee. It was hot. He felt it move down into his chest, and the thing behind his sternum eased, fractionally the way it eased only ever for very small reasons, and he stood there with the mug in his gloved hand, and Smoky pressed against his thigh and Hadley 3 feet away, and the gymnasium full of 42 people behind her, and he understood, in the small, quiet way he understood most things, that he had just made a decision. He did not name the decision. He did not need to. He set the empty mug on the folding table beside the door. He took off his gloves. He took off his jacket and hung it on a hook. He turned to Hadley and said, "How is the generator?" "It died at 7:45. Then we set up the second heater. Ed is already pulling it from the truck." "Good." He walked back out into the gymnasium. Smoky walked at his hip. The room was just beginning to feel the loss of the generator, the small subtle drop of 3 degrees that the families had not yet registered, and he walked out into the room with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and his bearing exactly what it had been before, because the room could not see what had happened in the parking lot, and the room did not need to see it, and he was not going to show it. Mrs. Bennet, on the bleacher 3rd row up, watched him cross the gym. Her pale eyes were sharp. She did not say anything. She lifted her tin mug at him. He nodded. He went to work. The day was long, the storm got worse, the temperature in the gymnasium dropped, then rose again as the second heater came online, then held a child threw up at 10 in the morning. A man named Frank Holloway had a small heart event at 1 in the afternoon, and Jax stabilized him with 2 aspirin and a calm voice and 20 minutes of monitoring while Hadley called the sheriff again on the satellite phone Mrs. Bennet had produced from her go-bag. The sheriff, this time, answered. The sheriff said no medical transport was possible until at minimum tomorrow morning. The sheriff said, "Hold tight." Jax held tight. Smoky held tight beside him. When dusk came down on the second day, and the wind howled harder than it had howled the night before, Jax was sitting on the bleacher again with his back against the second tier, and his hands loose on his knees, and Smoky was at his feet, and her amber eyes were on the door, and her ears were forward, and he saw by the angle of her head that she was watching something he could not yet see. Across the gymnasium, in the far corner under the east basket, a small girl named Maddie had been crying for 5 hours. Smoky's tail thumped, very softly. Once. Then she stood up. The girl was 6 years old, her name was Madison Kerr, and the people in the gymnasium called her Maddie, and her mother was a woman named Renee Kerr, who had left the gymnasium at 3 in the afternoon to drive 28 miles up the valley to her father's house, because her father was a type 2 diabetic on oral medication and a heart patient on a beta blocker, and her father had not answered his phone since the previous evening, and the storm had not yet been at its worst when she had left, and the storm was at its worst now, and Renee Kerr had not made it back, and the satellite phone had reached the county sheriff at the 4 o'clock check-in. And the county sheriff had told them that a vehicle matching the description of Renee Kerr's silver Subaru had been located in the ditch off mile marker 31, with its driver inside and unhurt and waiting for a tow that could not currently reach her. And Maddie had been told this news at 4:15 by the woman from the Methodist church, and Maddie had been crying since 4:15, and it was now 9:12 at night. She was crying in the small, high-broken way of a small child who has run out of every other resource. Her face was red and slick. Her hair was matted to her temples. She was wrapped in a wool blanket on a folded gym mat in the corner under the east basket, and she had been holding a stuffed rabbit by one of its ears for 5 hours. And the rabbit had been dragged across the floor every time she shifted, and the rabbit was filthy with the dust of the gymnasium floor, and Maddie did not know, and would not have cared if she had. The woman from the Methodist church had tried to comfort her, and Maddie had screamed. Mrs. Bennet had tried to comfort her, and Maddie had screamed. The school nurse, a thin, tired woman named Linda Caston, who had been awake since the previous morning, had tried to give her a small dose of children's antihistamine to help her sleep. And Maddie had not screamed at Linda, but she had not stopped crying either. And the antihistamine had been thrown up onto the wool blanket within 15 minutes, and Linda Caston had stepped back and rubbed her face with both hands and said, in the small private voice of a woman who had been a school nurse for 26 years and had reached the absolute end of her professional resources, I do not know what else to do for her. The room had fallen into a state of low collective despair around the child's crying. People were trying not to listen to it. People were trying to put their attention elsewhere. People were doing this because there was nothing else to be done, and because each of the 41 other people in the room had reached the end of their own ability to help. And Maddie's crying had become the soundtrack of the room, the constant and unbearable backdrop against which every other small task in the gymnasium was being performed. Children near her had begun to cry sympathetically, the way children do, and their parents had moved them to other corners. A man in his 60s named Rusty Dean had taken his hat off twice and put it back on twice and gotten up to do something about it and then sat back down because he did not know what to do about it. The propane heater hissed at its lowest setting because the propane was running low and would have to be rationed for at least another 12 hours. The LED lanterns cast their long-stretched shadows. The wind outside the gymnasium walls was a continuous low scream. Jax sat on the bleacher with his back against the second tier and his hands loose on his knees. He had been listening to Maddie cry for 5 hours. He had not approached her. He had not, in fact, looked directly at her since the news had come over the satellite phone at 4:15. He had heard in her crying the long and terrible sound of a child whose world had ended without her permission, and he had understood with a precision that lived below the level of language that there was nothing in his repertoire as a man that could help her. He had been a soldier. He had been a husband. He had been a son. He had been a brother in arms. He had not been a father. He did not know how to hold a small girl whose mother might or might not be alive. He did not know what to say. He did not know what tone to use. He had stayed where he was. He had drunk his coffee. He had checked the propane levels and the heater coverage and the temperature in the room and the integrity of the wedge at the back door, and he had let Maddie's crying move through him the way the wind was moving through the building, because he could not stop the wind either, and he had not believed there was any way in the next 12 hours that the crying was going to stop. Smoky stood up. He felt it before he saw it. Her shoulder slid out from under his right hand, where his hand had been resting on her without his quite noticing, and the absence of her weight registered along his palm like the small, soft click of a latch being lifted somewhere in another room. He turned his head slowly. He looked down. She was on her feet. Her head was up. Her ears were forward. Her amber eyes were fixed on the corner under the east basket. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She began to walk. She walked the way she had walked on the morning they had been discharged together, the morning the hospital orderly had tried to take her leash from his hand, and Smoky had refused, with a single small movement of her shoulder, to be led by anyone but him. She walked the way she had walked off a transport plane in Ramstein, Germany, with a half-healed gunshot wound through the meat of her left flank, and her tail still up. And she walked the way she had walked into a courtroom in Texas in the second week of his divorce when the bailiff had said no dogs, and Smoky had laid down at his feet and refused, with a perfect German Shepherd stillness. to be removed. She walked with the slow, controlled, deliberate grace of a working dog, moving toward a job that she alone in the entire building had identified as hers. She crossed 30 feet of cold gymnasium floor at a steady and unhurried pace. Heads turned as she passed. People who had been speaking went quiet. The woman from the Methodist church saw her coming and stepped back from the gym mat. Linda Caston, the school nurse, lifted her face out of her hands and saw Smoky, and her mouth opened and no sound came out of it. Maddie had her face in the wool blanket. She did not see Smoky coming. She was crying in the long broken sobs of a child whose voice had begun 2 hours ago to give out, and her shoulders were hitching, and the stuffed rabbit was clutched in both her hands now against her chest, and she did not see the dog until the dog was 3 feet from her. Smoky stopped. She did not approach further. She lowered her great head until her amber eyes were at the height of Maddie's bowed crown. She waited. The child lifted her face. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. Maddie had stopped crying briefly in the moment of looking. She did not understand what had stopped her. She looked at Smoky with her wet red face and her hitching breath, and Smoky looked back at her with eyes that were endlessly steady and ancient and unhurried, and the child made a small sound in her throat that was not quite a word, and Smoky took, very slowly and very gently, 1 step forward. She did not lift her head. She did not break the gaze. She took another step. She was at the edge of the gym mat now. The child did not move. The child was very still, with her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, and her breath was coming in small ragged pulls, and her eyes were on the dog. Smoky lowered herself to the mat. She did this in the slow, controlled motion of a working dog who has been trained never to startle anything. The long fold of her front legs first, then the slow descent of her chest to the mat, then the careful alignment of her hindquarters, then, last, the slow sweep of her great head around until she was facing the child directly, no more than 6 inches from the child's small wet face. She lay there. She did not move. Her amber eyes held the child's grey eyes, and her ears were forward, and her tail was still, and her breathing was slow and steady and audible. She lifted her head. She lifted it just high enough to clear the mat. She set it down again, slowly, with great care, on the small narrow chest of the child. The child's hands, which were still clutching the stuffed rabbit, opened. The rabbit fell to the side. Maddie's small hands rose very slowly, the way a hand rises in sleep, and her fingers found the thick double coat at Smoky's neck, and they sank into the fur, and they stayed there, and the child's whole body shifted, almost imperceptibly downward into the mat, as if a long weight she had been holding by herself for 5 hours had been, for the first time, set down beside her by someone large enough to share it. The crying stopped. The room stopped. It was the most absolute silence the Silver Pass Elementary and Middle School Gymnasium had held in living memory. The wind outside continued to howl. The propane heater continued its low hiss. The LED lanterns continued their slow, steady glow. But the human sounds in the room, the small, constant background noise of 41 people breathing and shifting, and clearing their throats and turning the pages of paperback books they were not really reading, all of those sounds went out at once, the way a candle goes out when a hand is placed over it. No one moved. No one moved for a long time. Maddie's small hand tightened in the fur of Smoky's neck. Smoky did not move. She did not lift her head from the child's chest. She did not adjust her position. She breathed slowly in and out, and the slow rise and fall of her ribs against the child's ribs settled into a single shared rhythm, and the child's breathing, which had been the broken hitching breathing of an exhausted 6-year-old in despair, began to even out, and the redness in her face began, very slowly, to recede, and her eyes, which had been fixed on the dog, began to drift closed. Within 4 minutes, she was asleep. Smoky stayed. She did not move all night. Jax watched the whole thing from the bleacher. He did not stand up. He did not approach. He sat with his back against the second tier, and his hands open on his knees and his eyes on his dog and the small girl in the corner, and he watched. And the thing in his chest that had been walled off behind scar tissue for 9 years did, very quietly, give way. It did not give way in the manner he had always feared. It did not break loose. It did not flood through him. It simply softened in a single place, no larger than a coin. And through that softness he felt, for the first time in a very long time, a feeling that was not pain. He did not know, immediately, what to call it. He bent his head, he put his face in his hands, his shoulders beneath the worn military surplus jacket whose cuffs had begun to fray 2 winters ago, began, very slightly, to shake. He did not make a sound. He had not made a sound in the small private moments of his own grief in 9 years, and he did not make one now. He sat in the corner of the gymnasium with his face in his hands and his elbows on his knees, and his back curved like a man holding something inside his chest that he was afraid would spill out if he let go, and he sat that way for a long time. Hadley saw. She was standing across the gymnasium near the camp stove with 2 tin mugs of coffee in her hands, and she had been there since Smoky had risen from his side, and she had watched everything, and she saw him bend his head and put his face in his hands, and she did not move toward him. She did not approach, she did not in any way intrude. She set the mugs down very softly on the folding table beside her, and she stood there with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on him, and she waited. She understood, in the small private way she understood most things, that what she was watching was not for her. It was not for anyone. It was a man in the corner of a gymnasium at the end of a road he had walked alone for a very long time, and the only correct thing she could do was let him have it. So she let him have it. Mrs. Bennet on the 3rd row of the bleachers watched also. She did not move either. Her pale eyes were soft. Her hands rested in her lap. She had lived in Silver Pass for 61 years, and she had buried 2 husbands and a son, and she had seen in those 61 years almost every kind of thing a small Montana town could produce, and she had not seen, before this night, a working dog cross a cold gymnasium floor and lay her head on a child's chest and stop the world. She watched it now. She watched the man in the corner with his face in his hands, and she watched the dog with her head on the child's chest, and she did not move, and she did not say anything, and her thin, steady hands began, after a moment, to tremble in her lap, in the way of a woman who had thought she had used up all of her crying many years ago, and was now finding, to her own surprise, that she had not. The night passed. The wind continued to howl. The propane heater hissed at its lowest setting, and Ed Boucher at the back wall monitored the gauge, and the children who had been crying in sympathy with Maddie had stopped crying, and the parents who had been holding them had laid them down on folded coats and surplus blankets, and the gymnasium had become, by some collective unspoken agreement, a quieter place than it had been in 18 hours. Maddie slept. Smoky stayed. At 3:20 in the morning the little girl rolled in her sleep, and her small arms came up and went around the dog's broad neck, and she settled her face into the thick double coat at Smoky's throat, and she slept on, and Smoky's amber eyes opened once, looked across the gym to where Jax was sitting, and closed again. Jax saw it. His face was no longer in his hands. His face was wet, and he had not bothered to wipe it, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them. And he looked at his dog with the small girl in her arms across 40 feet of cold gymnasium air, and he understood, at last, that something in him had moved. Hadley brought him coffee an hour before dawn. She set the mug down on the bleacher next to him and sat down 2 feet away. She did not look at him. She looked at the corner under the east basket where her old neighbour's daughter slept in the arms of his dog. "Mr. Harlan," she said, softly. "Jax, Jax," she paused. Her voice was very low. "What is your dog's name?" "Smoky." "Smoky," Hadley said the name carefully. The way a person says a word in a language they are just beginning to learn. "Where did she serve?" "2 deployments." "Where?" "The second one in Helmand." "And the first?" He looked at her. He did not answer. The thing behind his sternum had eased, and it was easing further now, and he understood that something he had carried alone for 10 years was no longer, perhaps, going to be carried alone. But he did not yet have the words to tell her, and he did not yet have the readiness to give them. "That's all right," she said. "You don't have to tell me yet." She drank her coffee. He drank his. In the corner under the east basket, Maddie slept on, with both her small arms around the great dark neck of a German Shepherd who had served 2 combat tours and bled on foreign soil. And the dog did not move, and the room was warm, and the storm outside continued. And morning came. Day 4 of the storm broke in a thin grey light that did not quite become morning. The snow had stopped sometime around 3 in the morning, the first stoppage in 81 hours, and the silence that had descended on the gymnasium afterward had been so unfamiliar that 2 of the older men had gone outside in the dark to confirm it, and they had come back in stamping the snow off their boots with strange small smiles on their faces, the smiles of men who had forgotten there was an end to weather. The wind had not yet died. The wind would not die for another 20 hours, but the snow had stopped, and the temperature had begun to climb. And at 6:15 in the morning, the satellite phone had reached the county sheriff, and the county sheriff had said that a snowplow was 3 hours out from Silver Pass, and that medical transport could be arranged by mid-morning for the most critical cases, and the gymnasium had received this news with a kind of soft collective exhalation that had not immediately become joy, because the people in the gymnasium had been worn down past the point where they could feel joy quickly, but had become instead a slow, steady leaning forward, the small physical signal of a community that had decided, together, that it was going to make it. Maddie's mother had been pulled out of her vehicle at 4:30 in the morning by a Forest Service plough team, and was being held at the volunteer fire department in Hamilton until the roads back to Silver Pass could be cleared. She was unharmed. Her father, miraculously, had been found in his living room with a near-fatal blood sugar reading but otherwise alive, and a county nurse practitioner had been with him since 2 in the morning, and he was stable. Maddie, when this news was relayed to her at 6:50 by Linda Caston, had received it with the strange placid unsurprise of a child who had spent the night sleeping in the arms of a working dog, and had emerged somehow with the absolute certainty that her mother was going to be all right, because Smoky had told her so. In a language that did not require words, she had eaten breakfast. She had eaten 3 full pancakes off the griddle that Ed Boucher had set up at the back of the gym, and she had eaten them sitting cross-legged on the gym mat with one small hand always resting somewhere on Smoky's flank or shoulder or back. And Smoky had lain there eating nothing, watching the room, and her tail had thumped exactly twice, when Maddie had laughed for the first time at something Cole Voss had said, and the room had heard the laughter and had quietly absorbed it, and the gymnasium had become, around that small sound, a different room than it had been the night before. Hadley brought Jax a tin mug of coffee at 7:15. He was sitting at the folding table near the side door. He had a small leather notebook open in front of him, and he had been making notes about supply rotations for the day, and his right hand was holding a pencil, and his backpack was on the floor at his feet, half open. The way backpacks of soldiers are always half open when soldiers are using something out of them. Smoky had returned to him at 6:30, when Maddie had gone with her mother's friend Linda to the bathroom, and Smoky was lying now with her chin on his boot. Hadley set the mug down on the table. She did not sit. She was looking at the backpack. "Jax," she said. "Hadley, what is that?" He looked. He did not immediately see what she was looking at. The backpack had been jostled at some point in the night, and a small object had worked its way to the open mouth of the main compartment, and it was sitting now half on top of a fold of canvas, half in shadow, and he had to lean down and tilt his head before he saw it. It was a small carved wooden bird. It was about the size of a chicken egg. It was carved from basswood, in the simple folk style of a man who had learned to whittle by watching his grandfather, and it had a rounded body and a small upturned tail and 2 carved wings that lay flat against the body without articulation, and the eyes were 2 small black dots burned into the wood with the heated tip of a piece of wire, and the beak was the tiny precise V-cut of a knife held at exactly the right angle. It was not by any ordinary measure a remarkable piece of carving. It was by any honest measure the kind of small thing a man might whittle in 15 minutes by a campfire to give to a friend. Jax had 11 of them. He had carried this one in the side pocket of every pack he had owned for 10 years. It had moved with him from base to base, from VA hospital to VA hospital, from motel to motel, from the back of his truck to the floorboards of his cabin and back to the side pocket of his pack, and it had not, in those 10 years, ever been more than 15 feet from his person. He looked up at Hadley. Her face had gone perfectly still. She was not breathing. "Where?" she said. "Did you get that?" He did not answer immediately. He set down the pencil. He closed the notebook. He looked at Smoky. Smoky was awake. Her amber eyes were on Hadley's face. Her ears were forward. Her tail was perfectly still. He looked back at Hadley. "Sit down, Hadley," he said. She sat. She sat across from him at the folding table, and she put both her hands flat on the metal surface between them. And she said again, in the low, careful voice of a person who does not yet know how much of her own life is about to be undone, "Where did you get that, Jax?" He reached down. He took the wooden bird out of the pocket of the pack. He set it on the table between them. He turned it very gently until the small carved tail was pointing toward her, and the underside of it was visible, and on the underside of it, in small sharp letters scratched with a knife point, were 2 letters. TV. Hadley made a sound. It was not a word. She put one hand over her mouth. He waited. When she could speak again, her voice was a thin thread. "He used to make these. He made one for me every birthday. From the time I was 7. He stopped when—" He stopped. She took a breath. "Where?" "Helmand Province," Jax said. "January 2015. He gave me 11 of them. Over the course of the deployment, he gave them out to most of the team. I still have most of them." "Helmand?" "Yes. My father," Hadley said. The word "my" came out of her uneven, pulled. "My father was Thomas Voss." "I know," Jax said. Her face changed. It changed in a way he had been afraid of and prepared for, the slow arrival of an old grief into a place where a new grief had also just arrived. And the arrival of one made room in some terrible way for the other. Her eyes filled. She did not blink them away. The tears ran down her cheeks in 2 thin parallel lines, the same way they had run on the night she had brought her son to his cabin in the snow, and she did not wipe them. And she looked at him across the small folding table in the cold gymnasium, and she said, "You knew." "I knew. You knew." "From when?" "From the day I bought the land in Silver Pass. That was August." "Yes." "You came here." "Yes." "You came here because of him." "Yes." "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked at her for a long moment. He did not answer. He did not, in fact, know how to answer. He had never spoken to anyone about why he came to the towns he came to. He had never spoken to anyone about Thomas Voss, except in a single official debriefing room outside Begram in February of 2015, and he had not spoken of it since. He had not believed in some deep place that he was permitted to speak of it. The promise had been a private thing made to a dying man on a frozen mountain, and Jax had carried it the way a man carries a child's body out of a building with both arms and his teeth set and no breath spent on speech. "I did not know how," he said. She nodded. The nodding was not agreement. It was the small fragmented motion of a woman trying to keep her face from coming apart. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened. Hadley, tell me." "I have not known. I have not known for 10 years. Tell me." He drank his coffee. He set the mug down. He looked at Smoky. Smoky's amber eyes had not moved. The room behind them was waking up and beginning its day, and people were laughing somewhere, and pancakes were being eaten, and the storm was ending, and at the small folding table by the side door, 2 people were sitting very still with a small wooden bird between them, he told her. He did not tell her everything. He told her only what she could carry. He told her that the operation had been a high-altitude reconnaissance, and that the team had been 6 men and a working dog, and that Thomas had been the youngest at 24, and had been a grenadier and a marksman, and had carried in his pack a small whittling knife and a piece of basswood. He told her that the mountain had been 12,000 feet, and that the cold had been -26, and that the supply convoy that was supposed to bring fuel and food and ammunition had been turned back at a lower checkpoint due to a logistical error nobody on the mountain had been told about, and that for 41 hours the team had been on its own with what was on its backs, and that the storm had come in. He told her that Thomas had been hit on the second night in a small confused engagement at the southern edge of the position, and that the round had gone through the side of his abdomen, and that they had not been able to get him to medical, and that he had taken 9 hours to die, and that he had been awake for most of those 9 hours. He told her that Thomas had spoken only twice in the last 2 hours of his life. He told her what Thomas had said. He told her the words, "Don't let it happen. Promise me. Don't let it happen again." He was talking about the cold, Jax said. He was talking about the supply lines. He was talking about, I think, the way men get left out in places where the people responsible for them have failed them. He was not making a grand statement. He was just, Jax stopped. He drank his coffee. He was just trying to make sure I understood. Hadley did not say anything. I did not know what to do with it, Jax said, for about a year. Then I started digging. I started in a town in eastern Washington. I had a piece of land for 9 months. I dug 6 caches, I rotated supplies. I never told anyone. The town thought I was a paranoid. I left when the disability transferred, and I could not afford the property taxes anymore. I went to a town in Idaho, then a town in eastern Oregon, then a town in Wyoming, then a town in Northern California, then here. Why here? Because Thomas was from here. He never came back here. I know. He left when he was 18 and he never came back. My mother and I left when I was 4. He never came back here. He was not from here. He was just born here. He told me his hometown. Why? Because in the hours before he died, he told me a lot of things. Hadley looked at the wooden bird on the table. 5 towns, she said. 6, counting this one. 6 towns. 10 years. You have been digging holes for 10 years. Yes, for my father, for the promise. The promise was about not letting it happen again. I did not know which town. I did not know which winter. I did not know who. I just kept digging. And you came to the place where he was born. I came to the place where he was born. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry the way she had cried at the start. She cried in a way that had no sound and no movement, and her shoulders were perfectly still, and the tears ran out between her fingers and dropped onto the metal table, and she did not wipe them. He did not reach for her. He did not know how. He sat with his hands loose on the table, and Smoky's chin on his boot, and the little carved bird between them, and he waited, and after a long time Hadley took her hands away from her face and looked at him, and her face was wet, and her eyes were clear, and she said, "You are the man my father died next to." Yes. You are the man my father said his last words to. Yes. And you have been, for 10 years, keeping his promise. Yes. And you have been doing it alone, where no one would ever know, where no one was ever supposed to know. Yes. She looked across the gymnasium. She looked at her son, who was 4 years old, and who was eating a pancake at the far end of the bleachers, and who had on his head a small wool cap that her father, Thomas Voss, had knitted for her in 1993 when she was 6 years old, and which she had kept in a cedar box for 31 years and had brought out 10 weeks ago, and put on her son's head for the first time in his life. She looked at the cap on her son's head. She looked back at Jax. "He would have wanted you to tell me," she said. "I did not know if I had the right, Jax. He would have wanted you to tell me." He could not answer that. There was a sound at the side door. Carl Mercer was standing there. He had a clipboard in one hand and his other hand was on the door jamb, and he had been standing there for some unknown length of time. and his face was not the face he had worn for the last 4 months. The face he had worn for the last 4 months had been the face of a man who knew with absolute certainty who was inside his town and who was outside it. The face he was wearing now was the face of a man whose certainty had developed a long, fine crack along its surface. The kind of crack that would, if pressure continued to be applied, eventually run all the way through. "Harlan," Carl said. Jax stood up. Slowly. "I was not," Carl stopped. He cleared his throat. "I was not eavesdropping. I came over to ask about the propane. I was not." "It is all right," Carl Hadley said. Her voice was thin but steady. "It is all right. I just—" Carl looked at the wooden bird on the table. He looked at Jax. He looked at Smoky. The small, fine crack in his face widened. "Fractionally, Thomas Voss. I knew him. I went to school with him. He was 3 grades behind me, but I knew him. His mother used to bring him to the hardware store on Saturdays," Hadley said. "I know. He told me. He used to buy nails out of the bin. He used to whittle." "Yes," Carl said. The word came out small. "He died 10 years ago," Hadley said. "On a mountain. Because the people who were supposed to send food and fuel and bullets did not send them. Mr. Harlan was with him when he died." Carl Mercer did not speak. "Mr. Harlan," Hadley continued, and her voice was getting steadier now. The way a voice gets steadier as a person finds, in the middle of saying something hard, that they have decided to say all of it, has been keeping the promise my father asked him to keep for 10 years, in 6 towns, including this one, including the one where you have been calling him crazy since August." Carl Mercer set his clipboard down on the folding table. He did this very carefully. The way a man sets down something he has just realized he has been holding wrong his whole life. He turned to Jax. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "Don't," Jax said. Carl looked at him. "Don't apologize," Jax said. "Apologies are not your business with me." "Apologies are not what is needed here." "Then what is?" Jax looked at him for a long time. "Pick up a shovel, Carl." "What?" "There is a cache I did not finish in October. The second smallest one. The deep frost came in early. I want it lined and finished before spring. When the snow melts in April, I want to get it done. If you want to help me, you can come help me dig it out." Carl Mercer stood there for a long moment with his hands at his sides. Then he picked his clipboard back up off the table. He nodded. The nod was small. The nod was honest. The nod was, in its small, honest way, the absolute end of one part of his life and the absolute beginning of another, and he nodded it once, and he turned, and he walked away. And for the rest of the morning he moved through the gymnasium in a way Jax would not have recognized as the same man's movement 4 hours earlier. The plough came at 10:18. The medical transport came at 11:40. By 2 in the afternoon, the sun was out and the gymnasium had begun to empty, and people were going home in small groups to homes that would, with the supplies Jax had brought and the work the volunteers had done, be habitable through the next 48 hours of clean-up and recovery. The propane was holding, the water was holding, the food was holding. The sheriff had reported that the highway would be open by morning. The worst was over. Jax walked out into the parking lot with Smoky at his hip and Hadley behind him with Cole on her hip. And he stood in the cold, thin sun in his worn military surplus jacket, and he looked across the lot at his truck, and he did not, this time, have any thought of getting in it and driving away. He had something else in his chest. Instead, where the walled-off thing had been, he did not, yet, have a name for it. He thought he would have time to find one. April came late to Silver Pass, the way April always did, with a slow, reluctant softening of the snow along the south-facing slopes and a quiet murmur of meltwater in the ditches at the side of Sawmill Road. The cabin had not changed much. The flag was still on the metal table. The folded saucepan was still on the burner. The kerosene lantern was still on the kitchen counter, although it had not been needed since the storm. Jax was kneeling at the rim of the second cache, the one he had not finished in October. The earth was soft now. He was lining the walls with cedar planks. Smoky was lying at the rim of the hole exactly where she had lain in August, her amber eyes half closed in the spring sun, her tail thumping softly, exactly once every minute or so. Cole Voss was beside him with a child-sized garden trowel. He was 4. He took his work seriously. He was levelling the gravel layer at the bottom of the cache with the precise care of a small boy who has been told that this work matters. In the distance, at the edge of the property, Carl Mercer was setting a fence post for Mrs. Bennett's chicken yard. Hadley came up the road with 2 tin mugs of coffee and a third small one of cocoa. She handed Cole the cocoa. She handed Jax the coffee. She stood at the rim of the hole. "What are you burying down there?" "Jax," Cole asked. Looking up, Jax looked at him. He looked at Smoky. He looked at Hadley. "What we owe," he said. "If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.